You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
He was the Beatle who smiled the least in photographs, the one who sat quietly in the corner while the world screamed for John and Paul. George Harrison was described by fans, journalists, and even his own bandmates as the gentle soul of the most famous band in human history. Soft-spoken, spiritual, measured. The man who brought the sitar to Western pop music and introduced a generation of teenagers to Eastern philosophy. On the surface, George Harrison seemed like the one Beatle who had genuinely risen above ego, above bitterness, above the kind of petty rivalry that tore the rest of the band apart. But that surface was hiding something. Beneath the calm exterior, beneath the meditation retreats and the Hare Krishna chanting and the quiet garden walks at his beloved Friar Park estate, George Harrison carried something heavy. Something unresolved. A resentment so deep, so personal, and so long-standing that it outlasted the band itself, and in many ways, followed him all the way to his deathbed today. We are going to talk about the man George Harrison truly hated more than anyone else in his life. Not a music executive. Not a tabloid journalist. Not even a rival from another band. This was someone George had known since childhood. Someone he had laughed with, performed with, and grown up alongside. And yet, when the cameras were off and the pleasantries were done, this relationship was defined by something far darker than friendship. So who was it? And what exactly happened between them? Let's go all the way back to the beginning, because to understand the hatred. George Harold Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a small terraced house at 12, Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool. He was the youngest of 4 children born to Harold and Louise Harrison. His father worked as a bus conductor, and the family lived modestly. The house had no indoor bathroom and was heated by a single coal fire. By modern standards, it was a life of quiet deprivation. But inside those thin walls, there was warmth of a different kind. His mother Louise was the defining early influence on George's musical soul. She was an enthusiastic, almost recklessly passionate singer whose voice could reportedly shake the windows of their home. During her pregnancy with George, she regularly tuned into Radio India broadcasts, drawn to the hypnotic rhythms of sitars and tablas. Years later, George himself would make the sitar his signature instrument, a fact that feels less like coincidence and more like destiny, as though the music had already been planted in him before he even took his first breath. When George was around 14 years old, his mother Louise purchased him his first guitar for £3.10, a sacrifice for a working-class family that George never forgot. He practiced obsessively, often until his fingers bled. He sketched guitars in the margins of his school notebooks. He was consumed by music in a way that went beyond hobby or ambition. It was identity. It was purpose. And it was music that led him, quite literally, to the people who would define his life. The story of how George Harrison entered the orbit of the Beatles begins not on a grand stage or in a professional recording studio, but on an ordinary Liverpool city bus. It was there that a young George Harrison befriended Paul McCartney, a boy from a nearby school who shared his almost feverish obsession with guitar. The two bonded immediately, swapping chord shapes, sharing records, staying up late to figure out new techniques by ear. Paul McCartney has spoken fondly of those early days, describing George as something like a younger brother. And for a while, that is exactly what he was. When Paul brought George to meet John Lennon and the rest of his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, in 1958, George had to audition twice before being accepted. John Lennon, who was 17 at the time, thought 15-year-old George was simply too young. But George played the lead guitar part from a Carl Perkins instrumental so cleanly, so effortlessly, that Lennon eventually relented. From that moment forward. The 4 boys who would become the Beatles were bound together. They played Hamburg clubs until their fingers were numb and their voices were raw. They slept in cramped conditions, ate badly, drank too much, and forged the kind of bond that only shared struggle can create. They were brothers in every sense except blood. But even in those early years, the seeds of something more complicated were being quietly planted. When the Beatles exploded onto the world stage in the early 1960s, the band's identity was immediately shaped around a simple, powerful narrative. Lennon and McCartney were the geniuses. They were the songwriters, the creative engine, the faces on the magazine covers. Ringo was the lovable drummer. And George was the quiet one. That nickname, the Quiet Beatle, was never meant as a compliment. It was a polite way of saying that George existed slightly to the side of the main event. And as the years passed, George began to feel that distinction more acutely than anyone outside the band could possibly understand. His songs were consistently pushed to the margins. While Lennon and McCartney were given free rein to fill albums with their compositions, George was typically allotted 2 or 3 slots per record, if he was lucky. His early contributions were acknowledged but rarely celebrated by his bandmates with genuine enthusiasm. He was the junior partner in a firm that never quite promoted him to equal standing. What made this particularly painful was the fact that George Harrison was, by any objective measure, becoming an exceptional songwriter. His work was growing more sophisticated, more personal, and more musically adventurous with every passing year. By the time the Beatles were recording Revolver in 1966, he contributed Taxman, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You, 3 compositions that stood comfortably alongside anything Lennon or McCartney had written for the record, but recognition within the band was slow to come. And from one specific member of the group, it sometimes never came at all. When people talk about tension within the Beatles, the conversation almost always drifts toward George Harrison and Paul McCartney. Their feud was more visible, more documented, and in some ways more theatrical. But the relationship that truly scarred George Harrison, the one that left the deepest and most lasting marks, was his relationship with John Lennon. To understand this, you have to understand what John Lennon meant to George Harrison in the beginning. Lennon was not just a bandmate. He was an idol. He was the older boy who had the charisma, the sharpness, the fearlessness that George quietly admired and perhaps envied. When George first joined the Quarrymen, he was desperate to earn Lennon's approval. He practiced harder, stayed later, tried to match the wit and confidence of a boy who seemed to have been born performing. For a while, there was genuine warmth between them. In the early years of Beatlemania, John and George shared a dark, sardonic sense of humor that set them apart from Paul's more polished, crowd-pleasing personality. They were the cynics in the group, the ones who rolled their eyes at the more commercial instincts of their bandmates. In many ways, they were natural allies, but alliances inside the Beatles were never permanent as the band evolved. Lennon's attitude toward George's creative contributions shifted from occasional dismissiveness to something more consistent and more cutting. When George began exploring Indian music and Eastern spirituality in the mid-1960s, Lennon initially showed interest, even joining the rest of the band on the famous trip to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in Rishikesh, India in 1968. But where George's spiritual journey was deeply sincere, rooted in years of genuine study and devotion, Lennon's engagement was more impulsive, and when he lost interest and left the ashram early, he began to mock the very beliefs he had briefly flirted with. For George, this was a profound betrayal. His spirituality was not a phase or an experiment. It was the foundation of his life. To have Lennon, the man whose opinion had mattered so much to him for so long, dismiss it as naive or ridiculous was humiliating in a way that went far beyond creative disagreement. The recording studio was where the wounds became most visible. During the sessions for the White Album in 1968 and the Let It Be project in early 1969, the tensions within the band reached a breaking point. And much of what George experienced during those sessions came directly from Lennon. George arrived at those recording sessions with songs he had spent months, in some cases, years, carefully crafting. He was ready to contribute meaningfully to the band's creative output. Instead, he found himself in a dynamic where his ideas were regularly talked over, minimized, or simply ignored. In the famous footage captured during the Let It Be sessions at Twickenham Studios, viewers can see George attempting to work through musical ideas only to be interrupted and corrected by his bandmates, with Lennon's dismissiveness particularly apparent. The situation grew so unbearable that on January 10, 1969, George Harrison walked out. He quit the Beatles. He had reached a threshold that he could no longer endure. Years of being made to feel like a creative second-class citizen inside the band he had helped build from the ground up. In interviews given in the aftermath, he described feeling suffocated, undervalued, and exhausted by the interpersonal dynamics that had grown so toxic. When he returned 12 days later, the conditions had changed slightly, but the underlying dynamic had not. George pushed forward, and the songs he eventually brought to Abbey Road that same year, particularly Something and Here Comes the Sun, were widely celebrated as two of the finest tracks on the entire record. Frank Sinatra would later call Something the greatest love song of the previous 50 years. John Lennon himself admitted it was the best song on the album. But even that acknowledgement arrived with complications. Because Lennon's praise, when it came, always seemed to carry a faint undertone of surprise, as though George's brilliance was somehow unexpected. As though he had accidentally exceeded the low bar that had been set for him. For a proud, deeply feeling man like George Harrison, that kind of conditional admiration was perhaps worse than no admiration at all. When George Harrison published his memoir, I, Me, Mine, in 1980, the music world paid close attention. Here was the quiet Beatle, finally speaking in his own voice, telling his own story on his own terms. Journalists and fans expected revelations, reconciliations, perhaps some gracious tributes to his former bandmates. What they found instead was a carefully constructed silence. In a memoir ostensibly about his life and music, John Lennon, one of the most significant figures in George's personal and professional world, was barely mentioned. The omission was not accidental. George Harrison was too deliberate, too considered a person to leave something like that to chance. The near-total absence of Lennon from the pages of his own autobiography was a statement. And those who knew George well understood exactly what it meant. When the book was published, Lennon himself noticed the slight and was reportedly hurt by it. He gave interviews in which he expressed his displeasure, describing the omission as a kind of emotional erasure. The fact that this bothered Lennon so visibly only confirmed what many had long suspected, that the wound between them ran in both directions, even if George had been the one to bleed more quietly. John Lennon was murdered on December 8, 1980, less than a year after the memoir was published. George was devastated by the news. He grieved genuinely and deeply. He released All Those Years Ago in 1981 as a tribute, featuring Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, a rare, moving moment of reunion in the shadow of loss. But grief and resolution are not the same thing. George mourned Lennon. He honored his memory. He never, however, fully made peace with what had passed between them. The hurt was too embedded, too old, too much a part of the architecture of who George Harrison had become.